Dr. Temple Grandin has been described as a rock star for the world of autism spectrum disorder. Why? I probably can't say it better than Oliver Sacks, and if you know who Oliver Sacks is, he wrote Awakenings. Temple Grandin's voice came from a place which had never had a voice, and she spoke not only for herself, but for thousands of others. By the way, Dr. Sacks also wrote an essay called An Anthropologist on Mars, which was about Dr. Temple Grandin, and it's a phrase she used to describe herself. I've had some wonderful conversations with Temple, including ideas from her book, Developing Talents, on working on career development for those with Asperger's and autism. Her visit here today at Boulder for authors at Google is based on the fact that A, she's just down the road from us, which made it convenient, and B, she has an extremely busy calendar driven by the release of in January of her new book, Animals Make Us Human. Her work for the humane treatment of animals, and humans for that matter, have been world-changing, not only for myself, but for the others on Project Spectrum, and for all Googlers. We'd like to welcome Dr. Temple Grandin.
Well, it's wonderful to be here today. I think I'll just start out and talk a little bit about what autism and Asperger's is. Autism is a continuum going from very, very severe, the child's going to remain nonverbal, all the way up to a brilliant scientist, like Einstein. It's a continuum of traits. A little bit of autism, you're going to get people that are really, really smart. Too much autism, and you have a very severe problem. It's a continuum. I want to emphasize enough, if you know anybody that has a child with autism, that early intervention is really important. I'm not going to be going into any of those details today, but the worst thing you could do with a young autistic child is to let him just sit and watch TV all day. And that's all he does. Now, one of the things about people on the spectrum, all levels of the spectrum, is they get fixated on their favorite thing. Maybe this kid's just infatuated with airplanes. All he wants to do is draw airplanes. But what he's got to learn how to do is how to take his ability, and there usually is an area of ability, and broaden it out and do things other people want. Now, I just had a demonstration of SketchUp this morning. I have to say I was very, very impressed. And this is the kind of program that can be used to get kids interested in, architectural design, drawing, animation. And one of the important things you got to teach these kids is they got to learn how to do an assignment that somebody else wants. I was a child of the 50s. And of course in the 50s, all girls were taught sewing. So when I was in 3rd grade, my mother bought me a toy sewing machine that you cranked. And by the time I was in 4th grade, I was making costumes for the school play on my toy sewing machine. And I realized that that taught a really important skill, taking my ability in sewing and doing something that somebody else wants. So let's figure out how we can use SketchUp in a really good way to help these kids. And one of the ways is you show them they learn how to use the program. But they can't just make, Denver airports, and that's all they want to make. You've got to broaden it out, and they've got to make convention centers and office buildings and houses, and learn how to do an assignment that somebody else assigns. And that's something I learned very young. When I was in high school, I was a goof-around student. I was a real poor student. I didn't study. I didn't see a reason to study until I got a goal. And that goal was becoming a scientist. And I owe a lot of credit to my mentor, science teacher, Mr. Carlock, who got me interested in science. But while I was messing around in school, I was very busy. I took care of the horses. For 4 years, I cleaned out, 9 horse stalls every single day. Fed the horses, put them in and out of the stalls, shingled the barn, built all kinds of stuff, made signs, and I realized I was learning important job skills. Because one of the problems I'm seeing today, a lot of people on the autism Asperger spectrum, is they're not being taught job skills. When I was 13 years old, again, sewing, that was a big thing for girls in the 50s, and actually sewing is really complicated. There's nothing simple about a simplicity pattern. And in my work with cattle handling, I had to just go from soft materials to steel, which is a hard material. But a lot of the same skills are there. So she had me working for seamstress when I was 13. And then when I was in college, I did internships at different places. One of them was a scientific research lab, because I had to start learning employment skills. Now the thing about people on the spectrum is skills are uneven. I'm a visual thinker. I think in pictures. My mind works like Google for images. Language is the index tabs for all the pictures that are in my memory. So you type in a keyword into here, the Google I've got inside here, and it searches all around the memory, pulls up things, and I get a picture, and then if I hold it there for a while, it turns into a video. And I can do 3D full motion video in my mind and walk through it. I had virtual reality in my head. In fact, Dr. Nancy Minshew, at the University of Pittsburgh, did a brain scan on me about 2 years ago and found that I have a gigantic big fiber tract going from the frontal cortex deep into the visual cortex, and it was twice as big as the controls. But the thing is, there's always an uneven skill. Algebra was absolutely impossible for me to do. There was nothing there to visualize, because my visual thinking is photorealistic pictures. Now I've been finding, now that I've been talking about this a lot, that there's a lot of kids out there that cannot do algebra, but they can do geometry, trig, and calculus. And algebra needs to be skipped. And I've had parents say to me, what do I do about the school system? I said, look, let the kid take geometry and trigonometry and get an A in it, and then you might find that you can deal with the school system. Now the thing that I found is that when you look at people on the spectrum, there's different kinds of minds. You can have a photorealistic visual thinker like me who can't do algebra. Another kind of mind is the pattern thinker. It's a more abstract kind of visual thinker. This is the kind of person who would make an excellent computer programmer, because they think in patterns rather than in photorealistic pictures. Where the kind of careers that would be good for somebody like me is industrial design, graphics, animation, anything that has to do with realistic pictures. This other kind of minds, the engineering mind, the computer programmer kind of mind, they're often weak in reading and writing composition. And then there's a third type, I call it a word mind. They often make really good journalists. They know hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of facts about their favorite thing, whether it be football players or movies or whatever it is. They'll know about it. Now, getting back to famous people that might be on the spectrum, Einstein today would be labeled with autism. He had no language until age 3. I wonder what would happen to somebody like Einstein today. Tesla, the inventor of the power plant, also would have been labeled with autism. Okay, what's the difference between Asperger's and autism? Asperger's is just milder. There's no speech delay. Now, I get very, very interested in the brain research in autism, and some of the brain research is showing that there's problems with the interdepartmental connections between different parts of the brain. Now, I have to think in pictures, so I like to have a kind of a visual way of sort of visualizing how the brain is wired. You've got this big corporate office tower. Up at the top, you've got the president, the chief executive officer. Then you got the division vice presidents. Okay, that's all the suits up there, front office stuff. Then underneath that, you've got the emotions center, and then you got all the tech departments, all the fun stuff. Programming, graphic arts, all that kind of good kind of stuff. And where the problems are in the brain of the person on the spectrum is there's not very many connections going up to those suits upstairs, up there in the frontal cortex. They're lucky to get one dial-up. But down in the basement of the building where the techies are located, they've got 100 super high-speed internet accesses and all kinds of extra cabling. And that's kind of what happens in the brain. Now, it also happens that a lot of social circuits aren't hooked up. And the thing is, I had to learn social rules like being in a play. And in the 50s, all kids were taught to say please and thank you, to have good manners. Those things were drilled into me as a very, very young child. And this really, really helped me. I'm seeing a lot of very, very smart, brilliant Asperger kids today losing jobs because they comment on fat people. Well, I learned when I was 8 years old, the comments about how fat my Aunt Bella was were just not appropriate comments. I get grounded for a week if I made those kind of comments. It just was absolutely wrong to be doing that. There's also been some other very, very, very interesting scientific research on the brain. And what was found in the research at Casanova was there's more mini-columns per square inch of brain. In other words, more processor units. So there's kind of two ways that brains can be made, and some of this is just normal variation. You can make a brain to be very cognitive and logical, thinks things out, but it's slow, processes slowly. Or you can make a brain that is very social, emotional, and really fast in processing. And I've often said, if you got rid of all of the genetics that makes autism and Asperger's, we'd still be living in caves. Because who do you think made the first stone spear? Well, there was somebody over there with Asperger's that made the first stone spear, figured out how to chip that rock. It wasn't all the social people yakking around the campfire. Now, let's get into the whole job thing again. We've got, if you're involved with any teenagers, we've got to get into teaching job skills really young. Cannot emphasize that enough. And I was taught things like being on time. When I was 7 years old or 5 years old, my mother got me an alarm clock. I was expected to set it and get up. Let's talk about how can we help the Asperger person that's in the workplace. One of the things they need is they need clear assignments. You don't give them something vague. Well, just develop some new software. That's too vague. You might say, okay, I want SketchUp to do a certain function, and you can only use this much memory. You've got to make it specific, with a specific outcome that you want. On the things I designed for livestock, I mean, I had to, the plant ran at a certain speed. I had to make sure it would work for them. There was a specific outcome for the project. Don't be vague. Another problem that I have is I absolutely cannot multitask. Cannot multitask. But the thing is, jobs like programming, you're not multitasking. You're sitting there in your office on your computer, and the phone's not ringing, and you're hopefully not text messaging and stuff in the middle of it, or you're not going to get it done. It doesn't involve multitasking. The problem is that for some of the entry-level jobs, there's some of the worst jobs, like working in a grocery store, running a cash register, because it's just plain too much multitasking. The other thing that I cannot do is I cannot remember long strings of verbal instructions. Or they might say, well, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. Written instructions. Can't emphasize that enough. And the other thing is, the person on the spectrum is not going to be very good at figuring out some of the nasty office politics that goes on. And that was a very, very difficult thing for me at work. I actually had some situations with some of my livestock clients where equipment was actually deliberately sabotaged. And the reason why this happened was the resident engineer didn't like this nerd coming in to his territory and showing him how to do things. And there's been some sad stuff where somebody that worked, an Asperger person that worked in an architect's office, somebody put porn on his computer to get him in trouble, sabotage his work. That was very disheartening for me, because I kind of naively believed that, everybody would be good. Now, unfortunately, at the age of 61, I kind of chalk it up to just sort of, bad human behavior. And I've always said, the engineering is the easy part, it's dealing with all the people problems. And I found the best way to deal with some of those people problems is you just gotta go pull that jealous person into the project, give them a little piece of the action, and lots of times that stops a lot of that jealousy. But I think we've got to start thinking, teenage kids, how are we going to get them into the job world? And this is what I like about something like the SketchUp program. Another thing I like, that Spore creature creator, but they got to learn how to make a creature that somebody else assigns. Because this can be used to teach job relevant skills. Okay, in the beginning, we just let the kid play with the program, learn how to use it. But then we've got to start doing assignments, like maybe make your own house in it. Where that's learning that essential job skill. Because I'm seeing smart Asperger kids graduating from college, and they've had no job experience. They've never mowed a lawn. They've never had to do anything for themselves. Well, this is where I'm saying where a 50s upbringing did make a big difference for me. Now, another thing we got to worry about with some of these people are some of the sensory sensitivities. And these sensory sensitivities are very variable. And you can have a lot of people around, they aren't necessarily labeled autism or Asperger's, some of the dyslexic people that are really brilliant, ADHD, and some of the other labels. And I want to emphasize, these labels are not, they're not precise. They're not precise diagnosis. It's not a precise diagnosis like a diagnosis for tuberculosis. It's a behavioral profile. Someday in the future, this can all be replaced with brain scanning, but the computers aren't quite fast enough yet to be doing that kind of stuff. But some people have hearing sensitivity problems. The fire alarm goes off, hurts their ears. When I was a child, when the dentist, when I was a child and the fire alarm went off, hurt my ears like a dentist drill hitting a nerve. Terrible. Other people on the spectrum, well, we're going to do a text messaging during this. Maybe we ought to share that with everybody. Okay? Okay, good. One time I was at a meeting, someone was right in the front row with his BlackBerry underneath the table, and I asked him to share the emails with everybody in the meeting, and it turned out he was very, very important, big important person. I'm really embarrassed. That's what I do when you don't play with your gadgets when I know. And maybe you can multitask. I can't. Let's talk. And I want to just end up with my formal presentation on some of the visual things, and then the whole rest of the period I want to just do questions. And I don't have visual processing problems, but there's some people that do. And when they go to read, the print jiggles on the page. They'll often complain about fluorescent lighting, that the fluorescent lights flicker and really bother them, really drive them crazy. They often hate driving at night. And some of these people are great pattern thinkers. I had a dyslexic student. She actually made Mensa. And she was a pattern thinker, very good at higher mathematical things, absolutely could not draw. She probably would have been a very good programmer. She chose instead to go into animal-related types of things. And some of these problems with visual processing are pretty debilitating because the room is flickering on and off like a discotheque. It used to just make her totally space out. And there's some simple things you can do to help a person that has these problems. And one is an LCD laptop computer, because it's one of the few screens that doesn't flicker. You can print things on colored paper, sometimes helps. And another thing that sometimes helps, and this sounds kind of crazy, is colored glasses. And you find just the colored glasses that work for you. Some people it's pink, sometimes it's light blue, or it might be light brown, different pale colors like that. And you just try them on until you find out the ones where it no longer flickers anymore. It's called Irwin lenses. And my student would have flipped it, and sorry, it's going to be one of the reasons I'm having some problems is I don't have my slides. And my slides, my PowerPoint presentation, I use that to cue me. Sort of like for memory access, sort of like putting a keyword into the computer. And I don't have those today. I'm trying to read some notes, and I just want to finish up.
You're doing great.
Okay, on some of these sensory issues. Sensory issues are real issues, and they can make a normal workplace just intolerable for certain people. And there are things that can be done to, correct that problem, especially on the visual things. Because my student ended up getting a laptop computer, which I bought for a project. And I walked into the office and I said, "Why are you using a laptop when there's two big computers there to use?" And she said she hated them. Well, I'm into geeking. So I said, "Okay, why do you hate them? Tell me why you hate them." And she said the screen was like a discotheque. And then she printed all her homework on tan paper. And then she went out and spent quite a bit of money to actually get Irwin lenses that were the precise, exact right color for her. That saved her career. And then she ended up getting her PhD, and she's doing really extremely well now. I think what I want to do now is let's just use the next half an hour, open it up to some really good discussion about job things and a lot of other things. And if nobody has a question, I'm going to pick somebody. Okay.
For fear of being picked, I'm just going to talk. I can imagine that if you've got someone in the workplace who has Asperger's, and I'm sure there are heaps of Google.
Oh, there's heaps of them, yeah.
Heaps of Google employees that have Asperger's, and if they're having a tough time with, visual stimulus or whatever it is that's making the workplace hard for them, they're not typically going to identify themselves as Asperger's. I wouldn't think. Are there clues for us as to how to help these individuals or to make changes sort of throughout the company that will make Google an easier place to work for people?
Well, the thing about somebody with Asperger's is they just need to be told very precisely what the rules are. Okay, let's say they violated some email rules or something, or using the company computer for something they weren't supposed to do. And you tell them, well, the company rule is such and such. But there's a lot of people that break that rule. This is something a lot of people on the spectrum have a problem with. There might be some company rule about shopping online, for example. And everybody else is doing it, why can't I do it? Or everybody else is speeding in their car, why can't I do it? You know, on most things I tend to be a rule follower. And I figured out in high school sort of a hierarchy of rules. And I use this hierarchy of rules for all rules in society. You know, if you want to have a civilized society where we have companies like Google and we have jobs and we've got food in the supermarket and things like that, you have to prevent the really bad things, like killing people, burning down buildings and things like that. You know, you never ever have a reason to do those things. And then the next rules are just your courtesy rules. And for the most part, you know, it'd be better just be overly formal and not be breaking those. But then I gotta have some places where I can break some rules. And I tell teachers, that's like stupid school rules. Yeah, you enroll that smart Asperger kid in a community college and take him out of a high school where he's being teased to death. You know, we gotta find out, where are those mentor teachers? So a lot of these smart Asperger kids get tortured with teasing. There might be some great things over at the courses and things over at the community college. You know, those are the kind of things we need to be getting into. So I call that illegal but not bad. Stupid rules I can break. And then the sins of the system. Well, in this country, it's sexual and drug offenses. Anything with that, you're in like so much trouble, it just isn't funny. You don't touch the sins of the system. Because when I was in high school and I went to boarding school, I learned I could do lots of illegals but not bad. Like fly my kite up on the hill of that staff member, ride my horse out in the pasture bareback, and things like that. They knew they could trust me on drinking, sex, and smoking. Those were the sins of the system in our school. So kind of using a framework like that, yeah, there's certain rules, you know, you can get away with breaking if you're kind of discreet about it, like maybe you only shop online at lunchtime, or you don't shop online for 5 hours a day. You need to be getting some of your other work done. But that's kind of helps me. And then there's certain things where you need to just sit the person with Asperger's down and just say, this is the rules. You know, when I got one of my first jobs, I was a real slob. And my boss brought in a can of deodorant, and he slammed it down on the table, and he says, your pits stink. You need to use this stuff. And I was very upset at the time, but sometimes they just need to be bluntly told. Like, let's say they're a filthy slob, or they're just really awful and rude. They just need to be told. And don't be subtle. They just need to be told what is expected. Now, the other thing is, a good boss makes a difference. Because there's kind of two kinds of bosses in the world of work. There's the good bosses that everybody likes. There's the bad bosses that everybody hates. And then there's another kind of boss where people on the spectrum have a real problem with him. He doesn't like the weird nerds, and he's mean to them. And that kind of situation, the person's going to have to change bosses. That's just not going to work. But an Asperger doesn't like being taken advantage of, like work to death and not getting any recognition for it. What they like is interesting work with clear-cut goals and get recognition for it. That's what turns on an Asperger. It's that simple. And what makes my life worth living is having interesting work. But another thing I'm really interested in now that I'm like 61 years old is helping the junior versions of me get into good jobs and get into good places to work like Google. This is what I want to see happen. I'm seeing too many times a brilliant 16-year-old got an IQ of 150, and they want to put him on welfare because he's got terrible social skills. Nothing's being done to develop strengths that he has that can be made into careers. See, the problem that educators have working with people on the spectrum is there's kind of two tiers of jobs. You've got the real smart ones that can work here, and then you have the ones that are lower level where appropriate jobs would be bagging groceries or doing janitor work or something like that. I'm going to pick, okay, right there.
So autism is a relatively new diagnosis. How old were you when you were diagnosed, and did it change your life?
Well, I was 2 years old when I was diagnosed in 1949, and they didn't know what autism was, so I was diagnosed as brain damaged. I was totally nonverbal. I would just sit and rock. And fortunately, I went into a very good neurologist in Boston. Her name was Bronson Crothers. In fact, there's an endowed chair named after her now. And she said, give her normal therapy, and referred the mother to a little speech therapy school that had teachers doing a lot of the same things that are done today, lots of one-to-one interaction. And then about 2 or 3 years later, that's when the autism diagnosis came. You gotta remember that, my mother had me, there were no support groups, but fortunately, she got some very good teachers for me very young. And one of the things that made my mother realize that she could get through to me is when she was playing on the piano and playing Bach, I was humming the Bach. Also, I think another thing that helped me, I was expected to do things. I was expected to have table manners. There was expectations for behavior. Sensory problems, I think you're going to have some people that need to have an office free of fluorescent lights, unless they're very, very high frequency electronic ones. That's something we're going to need to accommodate. It's probably the #1 environmental problem or sensory sensitivity problem in the office. That we have to accommodate. But all kinds of rudeness and things like that, no. I was expected to sit through Sunday dinners at my grandmother's. I was expected to sit through church. Did I enjoy some of those activities? No. But there were things we did together with the family, and I had to learn to behave during. But on the other hand, if the church had been full of loud music, that wouldn't have worked. It was an old-fashioned organ, and it was just fine. Okay, we just disconnected there.
She'll call back in.
Okay. Okay.
You tell a fascinating story in this book about how you solved the problem of what was keeping the cattle from sort of going up the chute. How you sort of noticed that there was metal and there was
Okay.
reflection. Could you tell that story?
Well, when I first started out my work, cattle handling, I go around all these different feed yards in Arizona, and I noticed that in some of the facilities they had for vaccinating the cattle went through some of the facilities really easily, and there were other facilities where the animals just refused to move through the facility. And so I got down the chutes to see what cattle were seeing. And people thought that was crazy. Now you gotta realize cattle have their eyes on the side of their head. They can see all the way around without turning their head. But I noticed that they stop at little reflections. A chain hanging down a chute, seeing a person moving up ahead, a car parked next to the chute with a shining reflection on it. They were noticing details that people didn't notice. And I have found that if you fix those things that the cattle are afraid of, then they're going to walk through the chutes a whole lot more easily. And again, when I started working on that in the 70s, people thought that was just really crazy.
Do you think it's possible for people to develop a sense of seeing to be able to sort of solve these kinds of problems, or does it require somebody with extrasensory?
I can train people to find the things that scare cattle. I actually have checklists for people to go through, and I can train people to do it. But let's look at something like visual thinking, and this gets into all the discussions about how much of a person is innate and how much of a person is learned in the environment. It's probably about 50-50. If I was going to draw a line on this board, and this is the continuum of visual thinking, and this would be totally visual here, and there's some people, they're rare, that are totally non-visual. I have run into a few people where there are no pictures at all in their head. Like for most people, if I say to you, think about your own house, you see it. But if I say, think about a factory, a lot of people just get kind of a vague image of a generalized factory. I see specific ones. John Deere plant in Moline, Illinois. First one that I see. But you have this continuum, okay, of what you're sort of born with in the brain, from being very visual and being not very visual. Now, you could take somebody that's maybe here, maybe I can move them to here. Or let's say I have somebody that's sort of right in the middle. I can move them this way, I can move them this way. But you can't move them all the way down the spectrum. I'm not going to get this non-visual person that has absolutely nothing wrong with their eyes and make her a visual person. I've gotten better with words as I've gotten older, but I'm still totally a visual thinker. When I think about new information, I think about it in pictures. The other thing that really helps a person on the spectrum is the more experiences that I have, I got more information in here that I can search inside my own head. I think it's very important to get kids with Asperger's out doing a lot of experiences. My mother was very concerned that when I was at the boarding school, that wasn't doing anything else. So she got set up for me to go to my aunt's ranch when I was 16 years old. And in the beginning, I was afraid to go to my aunt's ranch. She made me go. She said, you can go for 2 weeks or you can go for all summer. I ended up staying all summer. But I knew about that trip 3 months in advance. Remember, no surprises. Surprises scare these kids. But you sometimes have to push them to do stuff. You know, she was always getting me out, doing new things. Because the thing is, my mind is bottom-up thinking. The way I solve problems is I take bits and pieces of information I've got in my mind, and I put them together, sort of like putting a puzzle together to form something new. Where most normal people is top-down thinking. You got to have the hypothesis first. Sometimes it's vague and totally wrong, and then you try to cram all the data into it. I work the other way, and I found that the older I got and the more experiences I had, the better and better and better I got at thinking. Because it's sort of like filling up the internet with web pages. I mean, I'm sure everybody here can remember what the internet was like when it first started. There wasn't much there. Well, that's sort of like how my brain works. It starts out without much in it, and you have to fill it up with information, and then I've got previous experiences that I can compare something new against.
So without a hypothesis, how do you know what information to start collecting?
Well, you asked a question that's too vague. Okay,
How do you start?
How do I start? Okay, let's just start out with my cattle handling stuff. I started out by visiting every feed yard in Arizona. That was about 15 of them, and actually working cattle in each feed yard. And then I didn't know anything about this at all when I started. It's sort of go out and collect all the state of the art. You know, when I reviewed literature, when I was an undergraduate, I did an undergraduate thesis on how perception in one sense will affect another sense. I went and collected all the journal articles, and then I wrote down sort of the bottom line of each study on slips of paper, and I pinned them up on this board I called my logic board, and I just kind of saw what kind of categories they would go in. Because categories are the beginning of concept formation. And categories are a fundamental property of the brain. I'm always wanting to categorize things in the different categories. Now, you asked me a very general question. Why don't you ask me something more specific, how I would think about it, how I would have thought about it as a child, and how I would think about it now.
Well, I think I figured out my question based on your answer already, but
Okay.
I mean, basically, it's just an investigation, just like, say, Sherlock Holmes.
Well,
So
basically, if I want to invent something new, one of the very first projects I worked on, in fact, HBO's making a movie about me, and it's going to feature a dip vat project I did in the mid-'70s for some feed yards in Arizona, and they actually built a replica of a working dip vat.
What is dip vat?
A dip vat is back in the 70s, to get all the lice and all those parasites off of cattle, you had to swim them through a dip vat. They don't use them anymore now because they now have injectable drugs and things like that you give the cattle. But they didn't have that in the 70s. So I was hired by feed yards to design a dip vat. I already knew a lot about cattle handling, but I didn't know much about dip vats. So the first thing I did was I went and visited every dip vat I could find. Measured it, watched it work. Then I called up the USDA, I got their drawings. I called up Texas A&M University because they'd done a lot of work on dip vats. I got every paper I could get on. In other words, what I did is I collected the entire state of the art on dip vats. And then I go, okay, this part worked well, this was bad. It was sort of like putting the pieces together, keeping the good bits, getting rid of the bad bits. I also took some design stuff I had learned at a meat plant that I had in here, and I used that in the dip vat. And I came up with a really innovative design to prevent cattle from drowning. One of the big problems in these vats is cattle were drowning. And the old design had a horrible slippery ramp, but they'd slide the cattle down, then they'd flip over backwards. It was just awful. And I replaced that with a cleated ramp. And so the cattle would walk down a cleated ramp, and then there was a steep drop off under the water, because they have to go in and get under the water so that the chemicals get all the lice and all the ticks and everything else that's inside their ears out. And they used to have horrible sticks that they would shove the animals down with. With my new design, they walked down this little ramp, they'd step off, then it had a big metal shield over the top so they wouldn't jump, because that will also cause a lot of drownings. And then I had two gates that were like this so that I could adjust it so only one animal at a time could go in there. Those were three features that I put on there for anti-drowning. But I designed that based on a lot of things, a lot of previous knowledge, and then came up with a few new things. But my way of solving a problem is I got to take the whole state of the art first, because I don't want to be reinventing the wheel. Too often people are doing that. And it worked absolutely marvelous.
So when you go, after you've got all the information, you understand the fullness of the state of the art.
Okay.
Then you go into I'm presuming some kind of design.
Yep, then what I do, after I get the state of the art, I sat down at my drafting board,
Okay.
You gotta remember, this is 70s now, with no computers. I'd sit down at my drafting board, and I'd just start to sketch out very, very lightly some things. It was very important to do it to scale. That was really important. And in my mind, as I was drawing it, and I drew something, I could see it in my mind. In other words, the virtual reality that you're doing on SketchUp now, I did in my mind on the flat drawings. And I thought everybody could do that. I didn't know it was a special skill until I wrote my book, Thinking in Pictures, in the mid-90s, and I started interviewing people about, well, how do you actually think? And I was shocked to find out that most other people couldn't do these three-dimensional moving videos. Most other designers could do still pictures in their mind, but not the moving videos. I guess the Mountain View's totally off and not on back.
So can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
So would you say that your perception of space is is it you say it's like a moving video. Can you change where the camera is, or
Oh, yes.
playing something back?
I can change where the camera is. Like when I did my project on the dip pad for Red River Feed Yard, I could fly over it. I could walk through it as if I was an animal. I could walk around on the catwalks where the people would be walking around. And I could look at it from different angles, you know, see how it would work.
What I found interesting about your books is that I came to realize that autism is, I see it as more of an advanced, intuitive, sensitive faculty. And if you take a regular engineer who's going to build this system for the cow, they might build a better system, but they might not be able to empathize with the cow. Because it's an intuitive faculty to be able to see isn't it, to be able to see how the cow is working through the system, how to make it better for them.
Well, basically what I did is I can imagine what it would be like walking around with the cow's body.
That's an intuitive,
Yeah.
that's an
It's
intuitive skill.
it's visualization.
Right.
You know, what would it be like if I had a cow's body and, you know, I had to walk into this thing?
But an engineer or someone who has an architect, it would take an intuitive architect or an intuitive engineer to imagine how the people could move through the system in a holistic manner. So when I was reading your books, I was saying, I don't see a deficiency, I see an area of excellence, a specific area of excellence, which is an intuitive, empathic skill that, because we don't understand that, you have both the logical ability to develop the system, but you can also see how the cow, how the cow would move through the system. And a regular architect or engineer might not be able to move through the system they're creating in that intuitive way. So I was seeing a skill of excellence that was further developed in you that perhaps is something we don't fully understand.
Well, it's extreme visualization. And then the kind of mind that is the music and math mind, it's pattern thinking. I was reading a very interesting article on protein folding. There's a program called Fold It, and they actually have all these people, as volunteers, figuring out protein folding. And they found a few people that are actually calling them protein folding savants. And they think that these people are actually capable of doing some things that even the biggest computers, cannot do. And it's pure pattern thinking. It's not my kind of thinking. And in my PowerPoint presentation, I have a slide of extreme origami, where a praying mantis, this beautiful praying mantis thing, is made out of folded paper with no cuts and no Scotch tape, and there's a very elaborate, complicated folding pattern. That's not my mind. That's a different kind of mind. And I think one of the problems we have with educators is they don't understand these different kinds of minds. There's a photorealistic visual thinker like me. There's a pattern thinker where it's a more abstract form of visual thinking. If you want to read about that, you can read Daniel Tammett's book, Born on a Blue Day. But I'm getting very concerned that in our educational system, we are, these kids are going to end up, just as janitors or on welfare, because the teachers don't know how to build on these strengths and turn it into good jobs. I often wonder what would happen to Einstein and Tesla today. I hate to think about it.
Okay. When you're when you're able to sort of do these 3D visualizations in your head, are there other senses that you're experiencing as well? Are you hearing sounds? Are you seeing? Are you experiencing smells? Or is it purely visual?
Okay, the question was, when I experience these visual sensations, do I have other senses? My memory is indexed visually. In other words, memory always comes up as a still picture first, and language is the index, and language is the key word you type into my computer inside my head, brings up a still picture. Then if I hold the picture, I can get sound and smell and other sensations with it.
So it's not just seeing, it's other senses
I
as well.
can get other senses, but it's never cued on other senses. Like one time somebody asked me, think about a smell. And I saw a picture of my grandfather's summer house, a beautiful old summer house, and I could smell the nice smoky smell of the fireplace. But I got the picture of my grandfather's living room before I got the smell. And then I could smell the fireplace smell.
Do you think there are people who are cued off of smell and then they see the picture as well?
Okay, another question was, could a person be cued off of auditory first or smell? Absolutely. In fact, you have the people that are nonverbal. Smell and touch are the only senses that are giving them accurate information. There are some people on the spectrum where hearing is scrambled. It's like a bad mobile phone fading in and out. Seeing the images are broken up, kind of kaleidoscopically, and they're just getting a scrambled mess. But they can smell and touch things accurately. And there's also people that are auditory thinkers, because my dyslexic student that had all of these problems with her vision, she was definitely an auditory thinker. And when she did work with animal behavior, she listened to what does the animal sound like more than what does the animal look like. She was an auditory thinker, not a language thinker. So she could pull into the internet of her mind a huge amount of audio files.
I went to architecture school, and when I was learning how to be a designer, one of the things they tried to teach us was that you could look at a drawing. In the case of architecture, it was orthographic drawings, scaled drawings, and they would teach us to inhabit the drawing. That's what they would call it. And this was a process where I think it was you sort of look at the thing, and then you use that to build a model. That's the way I always thought of it. You build a 3D model that's kind of in your brain, and then you're free to move around it in whatever way you want. Does that?
Well, I think that people can improve their skills. Because, okay, if I asked, especially non-technical people, okay, think about a factory, and they get this vague image, or another question they use is think about a church steeple. And I was shocked to find out that a lot of people got this vague, generalized church. They didn't get the specific ones. I only see specific ones. There is no generalized one. There's a whole lot of specific examples. Now, if you take the person that gets a vague image of a steeple, and I say, now, close your eyes, and I want you to, start bringing up individual steeple pictures. They can do it, usually. But they have to work at it. It's a matter of this continuum. Okay, let's say they're here in the middle, and I can pull them over to here. Well, I can't get them to here, but I can pull them over some.
So can you build a representation by thinking of a dozen specific
yes,
churches? You can
I can take just like these CAD programs, when I can take bits and pieces of different churches and put them together to form a new one. Like we got one that's got a giant cross, doesn't have a steeple on it, and I could imagine taking the steeple off another building and putting it on that one. Or you want to paint pink or something like that, I can do that. You want to have it raining, you want to have it sunny, you want to have a wedding there, I can visualize that.
3 or 4 years ago, I heard you speak at the Boulder Bookstore, and you were telling the stories about how you invented and engineered these cattle facilities, but then also how you had to talk to boards of directors and CEOs at McDonald's or Burger King and convince them as to why this was important. And that was fascinating to me, because I imagine the inventing of the systems comes pretty naturally to you. But then going up and talking to the board of directors and almost giving them a sales job as to why you should be allowed to do this, I wouldn't think that would come as naturally. Can you talk about that a little bit?
On figuring out how to sell the jobs, actually it wasn't that hard. You just give them the economics. And I'd say, oh, well, if you put my system in, I can save you 1 man a year on labor. We can cut your workman's comp bills, way down. I just figured out all the financials, and that sold them. The other thing that sold them is I have a beautiful portfolio of pictures. This brings up another thing. A person on the autism Asperger spectrum has to sell their skill, not themselves. So people need to be developing a portfolio. They're not going to interview well. They're going to be poor, real poor at interviewing. And what's important for the person is, yeah, let's get away from the human resources department and show your stuff to the art department or the technical department or the computer department. Somebody who's going to really, like your stuff and have a really neatly presented portfolio, of your work. It could be programming code, it could be drawings, it could be music, it could be a whole lot of things, and you sell your work. And I had a very nice portfolio, and they would look at pictures of jobs that I had. I'd pull out my drawings. I can remember one ag engineering meeting, they thought I was totally weird, and then I pulled out a drawing, and they go, "Oh, you did that?" Well, then they took me seriously.
So have you used SketchUp? Do you use SketchUp?
No, I don't. In fact, what's happened now, I've been so busy with speaking, is I have a person named Mark who does all my drawings now. One of the things I'm spending most of my time doing now is, when it gets into the autism field, and the big things I'm really concerned about is careers. We're not doing enough on getting kids prepared for careers, on learning work skills. And we've got to get kids' fixations channeled into something that's going to be constructive. When I first got all interested in cattle chutes, all I want to do is talk about them all the time. People don't want to talk about them; they want them designed. We've got to take that thing. They get fixated. One really good thing you demonstrated with SketchUp was there was a kid that was fixated on Elmo. Well, you put Elmo in there so he could watch the child drawing something else. Okay, that's a good way to take the Elmo fixation and use it to motivate, drawing houses and things like that. Unfortunately, I'm 61, I'm kind of an old geezer, and there's all kinds of fun things that I'll have to leave for the younger generation. But what I want to see is, I want to see the younger generation doing things like SketchUp, not getting addicted to shoot 'em up video games. Some of these kids get addicted to these shoot 'em ups and they don't want to do anything else. We need to be getting them into the computer things that can turn into interesting jobs.
We've talked a little bit about mentors, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in talking a little bit about the mentors in your life. And so much of when you talk to people on the spectrum, it seems to happen kind of, by grace, or, falls from the sky that a mentor is there. Do you have any ideas on how we can sort of channel that a little more, not only in education, but also in job interviewing, as you mentioned, where they might not do well, and also in careers once they're in a company too?
Okay, the whole thing about mentors. One of my first mentors was Mr. Carlock, my science teacher. Ability attracts mentors. Somebody who might be a potential mentor, they see this kid's portfolio of drawings or computer programmers, they're going to go, wow, I'm going to want to work with that kid. That's just really great. Mentors can be at anywhere. They could be a teacher, a science teacher, they could be a retired engineer next door. I talked to one mom, she taught her kid DOS. Okay, that's really, really super old-fashioned. But, that sort of like got the kid turned on. Even if the mentor's skills are obsolete, you get the kid interested in engineering. Even if you taught the kid about vacuum tubes, that gets the kid interested in engineering and electronics. And then he'll learn the modern stuff on his own. But I've looked into the careers, into the backgrounds of a lot of successful Silicon Valley people on the spectrum where they made it in Silicon Valley, and somebody almost apprenticed that child into it, starting at a fairly young age. Now that doesn't mean that an older person can't be taught. I think some of these older ones, they're down in the basement, and you're going to have to drag them out and get them working on it. One of these kids need to be pushed a bit. And then my aunt out at the ranch was another really important mentor. I had some good mentors out in the industry. Again, they recognized my ability. They'd look at my drawings, and I think one of the ways to find mentors is you got to show off what the kid can do. There's going to be a lot of retired people, and retired computer people, retired engineers, even though the skills are old. That doesn't matter. You're getting the kid turned on to engineering or electronics or programming. even if he teaches something really old-fashioned. Then the kid's going to go out to the local Barnes & Noble and buy every book he can get on the subject. But I don't find kids going into Barnes & Noble and buying computer programming books on their own unless they got some formal instruction. There needs to be formal instruction to get it started. One of the things that Mr. Carlock taught me back when I was, in high school was how to use the scientific literature. Boy, and I can tell you that was a job because we didn't have a copy machine. You had to write the abstracts down on cards. It was awful. But he taught me how to use the scientific literature, and that took discipline. There needs to be some formal instruction, getting the kid interested. Let's say take something like SketchUp. They shouldn't just be playing with it. Okay, they can play with it in the beginning. Let's get them fixated on it. Then you start doing the assignments, and they got to start learning how to use all the different features, where you make almost like a SketchUp course for them, because they're going to need that discipline of learning in order to, work at a job.
There's a woman I work with in Texas who has a 5-year-old little boy who's on the spectrum, and he's currently obsessed with jetpacks. The jetpacks.
Yep. Okay. Yep,
so what would you? And she's doing all the reading.
And she's 5 years old. And
he is, yeah.
She's 5 years old and upset. Okay, so this little kid has this fixation of these jetpacks, where you can fly. Well, when he gets a little,
functions well, but he has social issues.
One of the things now, first of all, does he draw these pictures of these things? Talk about them? How does
I think he's talking about them, and then they were getting into SketchUp to start drawing jetpacks, I think.
Okay, well, let's start learning about. He's a little young at 5 to learn the physics of how they work.
Right.
When he gets a little bit older, he can be taught the math and physics of how a jetpack actually works. In other words, this is how you broaden it out. How does this thing work? There's a lot of science involved in how that works. Now, he's too young at 5, but okay, right now, okay, he wants to draw pictures of jetpacks. Well, let's draw pictures of where you fly with the jetpack. You got all kinds of places you can fly to. You see, what you have to do is you got to make that link back into the obsession. Just like Elmo watching the kid use SketchUp. That Elmo was there watching, that's enough that links it in. You see, because you want to use the motivation of the kid's fixation. It's got a tremendous motivation and you want to use it. But you always want to keep broadening it out. Keep broadening it out.
Good. Okay, we want to thank Temple very much for being here.